But before that, as I was saying, the government's counter-extremism programme has been under the spotlight quite a lot, actually, in relation to the Southport murders. This morning, Prime Minister said that Britain now faces a new threat and that terrorism has changed. Well, the government-led multi-agency Prevent programme aims to stop individuals becoming terrorists, and police also play a key role. Critics, including Amnesty, have been raising concerns about the pre-crime intervention scheme, saying that the vast majority of people reported under Prevent do not represent any threat, and it's interfering with their lives and freedoms, leading to many to self-censor out of fear of being reported. But how does this scheme work, and who is it meant to prevent? Well, let's talk to Richard Garside now, who's director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Richard, thank you so much for joining me again. It's good to see you. Prevent is often under the spotlight and has been criticised widely for many, many years. But I know that they were concerned and are concerned with being thought of as Islamophobic or racist, and turn their attention now more to trying to stop far-right young people. Does that render them useless to be so concerned?
Well, I thought you did a really good introduction to the issue, so much so I was beginning to wonder what I was going to be able to add to what you said. I mean, I've heard, obviously, these reports that those working on Prevent are somehow concerned of these accusations of racism. And, you know, certainly kind of anecdotally, it does appear that historically quite a lot of the caseload of Prevent has been, you know, individuals from Black and minority ethnic groups, including, you know, those who profess an Islamic faith. But I think, you know, I think it's probably a bit of a reach to then say that suddenly everyone's running scared and they're all suddenly targeting a load of white racists, because at the end of the day, there is a concern in this country about the rise of the far right and concern about use of violence by the far right. And in that context, it's perfectly reasonable for the police and other agencies to be concerned about their actions.
The thing is, though, that if they are, I mean, a terrorist can come in any shape or size, right? We know that. But when you look at the numbers, sort of eight out of 10, we are looking at extreme Islamist behaviour. So in terms of terror attacks, in terms of acts carried out, and indeed in terms of acts that are prevented, not by Prevent, but usually by the police at the later stages. So a lot of people would say, well, then you can't really be balanced. There is such a fear. I mean, we've got the same thing with the grooming gangs. You know, they're going to try and make it illegal to say Asian grooming gangs when we're talking about an Asian grooming gang. And I'm not talking about all Asians or all gangs, but when you want to get specific, you talk about these men were Asian, largely from Pakistani background, and they were in a gang who were raping girls. It feels like we're being silenced again into pointing out sometimes the obvious. If the facts back that up, that doesn't make you a racist.
No, indeed. And, you know, if in a future point you want to talk about the sort of whole issue about the grooming gangs, I'd be very happy to come back on the programme and discuss that. I do think it's important tonight. You know, I agree with it's really important we don't get into a form of denialism here, where we're effectively, you know, at risk of kind of gaslighting the public, who can kind of see the news reports and can think, look, I can see what's being reported here. We also need to remember, of course, that, you know, news reports can often be quite, you know, selective in what gets covered. So there is also that. One of the things to perhaps bear in mind with Prevent is that, I mean, the whole Prevent agenda emerged really out of the initial reaction to what happened over 9/11, which was very clearly a religiously motivated attack by Islamists on America and on New York in particular, and then following the 7/7 attacks in London. And so certainly, you know, in those early days and in many ways since, there has been a focus on religious and fundamentalist inspired terrorist activity, and a lot of that has been of a Islamic bent, and that's the reality of the situation. And you can see that in the numbers of organizations that are prescribed organizations also under the Terrorism Act, which many of them, I mean, the ones you'd expect to be there, like Al Qaeda, for example, but many of them are Islamic organizations in terms of their religious affiliation. I'm trying to use my word language carefully here. Although there's also a number of Irish paramilitary, Northern Irish paramilitary organisations who are prescribed as well. So there is a kind of a local flavour here, but there is also a kind of a long-standing, as it were, historical context where the prevent agenda came from. Now, whether it's fit for purpose in the future, going forward, of course, is an important part, because suddenly some of the most as it were, kind of famous or infamous violent attacks in this country are not formally counted as terrorist attacks. We're discussing the case in Southport, but I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think that the Ariana Grande bombing was not formally classed as a terrorism attack, although I'm very happy to be corrected on that. But one of the reasons is the definition of terrorism under the Act, where it does have to effectively be the use of violence or force or other forms of intimidation for effectively political purposes motivated by religious, ideological, or other motivations. And so if you have these characters who are effectively, bedroom warriors who just seem to have a very, very dangerous, obsessive focus and interest in violence and spectacular acts, but no obvious religious or political motivation, then they are certainly falling outside the current scope of the definition of terrorism. Now, whether they should be included in as terrorists, that's of course an important question. And I think one of the things the Prime Minister announced today was a review of how we think about these acts and how we define them.
When we look at this agency being a pre-crime agency, that actually disturbs me somewhat. But I don't know how else we do it. And Keir Starmer to say terrorism has changed recently, I actually would argue with him about that we've always had these bedroom warriors. I mean, look at those girls that went across to join ISIS. They were radicalized in their bedrooms. I mean, as long as I've been a reporter, and a journalist, we've been talking about people who are self-radicalized or radicalized in their mosque, and then they go and sit in their bedrooms and do it. Or you've got the new incels now who hate women. They're self-radicalized in their bedrooms. This is not a new phenomenon. I don't know why Keir Starmer is saying it is.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't obviously know the mind of the Prime Minister on this. And I mean, whether the 3 or 4 girls who went off to Islamic State would be classed as terrorists rather than actually vulnerable young women who were effectively groomed into a terror cult, I think is an interesting and important question.
They went to support a terrorist organisation.
They did, but they were also under the age of children at the time, and arguably they were also let down by the authorities. So I think there's a whole complex story about that. But I'm glad that you can raise the issue of incels and by extension young men with very, very violent and unhealthy attitudes and beliefs, often about women. I mean, this was the case, the Ariana Grande concert attack, for example. It was very clear this was largely young women at a concert, and they were targeted. The Southport, awful Southport incident, again, young girls at a Taylor Swift dance class. So we have here young men, and you can see this in some of the, the stories of these young men who then go on to commit very serious, horrendous acts of violence. That a lot of them have a background of misogyny, of violence towards the women and girls in their lives. And I don't think we're taking that seriously enough. And, a number of, feminists pointed out today that the Prime Minister talked about children being killed in Stockport, and they were certainly children, but they were also young girls. And I think we're not taking seriously enough the kind of growth potentially of just some very serious, violent, misogynistic movements and groupings, not just in this country, but across the world, which are very, very dangerous potentially.
Yes, I agree with you, terrifyingly so.
To answer your question, therefore, about pre-crime, I'm not myself particularly in favour of a pre-crime approach if what we mean by that is that we can just throw the net wide and scoop up a load of people, a few of whom potentially are going to be dangerous. I also, though, recognise the dilemma facing the police, other authorities, and ultimately the government, because if a government can't take adequate steps to seek to intervene and prevent very, very serious acts of violence against British citizens and indeed anybody living in this country, then frankly, what is the point of government at that point? So I do think that I welcome actually that the Prime Minister's announcing we need to have a bit of a review of the approach and the arrangements. I think it's important that we don't, as it were, bend the stick too far the other way and suddenly, there's kind of a carte blanche, just scoop up a load of people. At the same time, this really does need to be taken very seriously, because at the end of the day, we know that there are individuals who are bent on causing horrendous violence and harm to individuals, many of them actually girls and women. And if that's not taken seriously, then I do think that's a dereliction of responsibility by our government.
But when you look at the prevent and the 3 times that this murderer was reported to them, I mean, again, I understand from Prevent that you have to agree to be mentored. It's not something they can force you to do. So this troubled young man was referred to Prevent and could easily have said, "I'm not interested." What good are they in that case then? I mean, they're costing us tens of billions of pounds. If you can't force somebody who you know is going in the wrong direction to get help, then what is the point of Prevent?
Yeah, I mean, just on the figures, I think, again, I might be wrong about this, it's about 40 to 50 million, not 40 to 50 billion. But again,
let me just double check.
Happy to be corrected. Yeah. 40 to 50 billion would be about 10 times the budget of the current prison system. So I think it's probably 40 to 50. But nonetheless, your question and your point is obviously very important. I mean, there's about 6,000 to 7,000 individuals who are referred to Prevent every year. About 40% of those referrals come from schools, and about 30 to 35% of those referred are young people. I'm going to hazard a guess, mostly young men, between the ages of 15 and 20. Now, so that's interesting in itself. You know, we're talking about a relatively young age cohort, and that kind of, in a sense, says something about what Prevent is there to do, which is to seek to intervene early to try to de-radicalize. And they do that in a number of ways. They offer mentoring, can offer, maybe help with just thinking about where do I want to be in my life. Perhaps if there's a particularly strong religious element to it, maybe a rather distorted theological understanding, then it could include some theological mentoring, going speaking to respected figures in the community to help them think through their own views about their religion and what it means to them, and so on and so forth. Is it successful? Well, I mean, in one sense, it's kind of trying to prove a negative, isn't it? Because we don't necessarily know whether it should be compulsory or voluntary. I mean, I am in favor of the scheme being voluntary, because I think if you make it compulsory, then people are going to kind of, fold their hands and they're not going to engage. But it is worth bearing in mind, of course, and this has been one of the criticisms of Prevent. It might be voluntary, but it comes with let's put it politely, a rather firm hand around the shoulder. Because at the end of the day, individuals who are referred to Prevent, if they choose not to engage and it's felt they should engage, then of course the police and other agencies have different ways of seeking to keep an eye on them and make sure that they are aware that they are being kept an eye on. Now, again, whether those arrangements are effective enough is another question. And clearly, you're never going to have perfect safety in a complex society, but there will of course be questions asked about the individual involved in the Southport attack and whether things could have been done at an earlier point.
Good to talk to you, always is, and I will take you up on that offer when we talk again about the gangs, the rape gangs. So thank you very much indeed for making that. That's Richard Garside there, Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Right, got to take a quick break. Back in a sec.